Hello, and thank you for taking time out of your evening to tune into our SSC webinar series this evening. I'm Tommy Mooney, a senior S&C coach at the clinic here. Alongside my role here at the clinic, I work with a host of different athletes and different ages from a multitude of different sports, including team sports, individual sports, field sports, court sports, track and field, ranging in ages from 6 years old to 80 years young. Okay. My presentation today is going to be about how we can protect our young athletes in modern sport. I'm going to suggest a three-pronged model for optimum health and development. First and foremost, we're going to talk about the importance of the multi-sport and using multiple different sports and activities to try and enhance our movement vocabulary. By movement vocabulary, I mean trying to think of the more words you have, the more sentences you can make. So the more movements we learn, the more skills we can accomplish and showcase in our sport. We're going to talk about training loads and trying to find the optimal balance between rest and training. And then thirdly, we'll talk about strength and conditioning and utilizing things like resistance training to again enhance that movement vocabulary, increase our robustness, improve performance, and reduce the risk of injury. Okay, first, I'd like to present a story to you. So we have two kids here, both 7 years, 8 years old, so old enough to know that they know everything. Jack here on the right-hand side is a tennis player, adamant that he wants to become the next big thing in tennis. His parents are certain that he's going to become a tennis player, and his whole life revolves around playing tennis, training tennis, and getting as good at tennis as possible. Okay. Jill here on the left-hand side plays a multitude of sports, gymnastics, tennis, GAA, and athletics, outside of her busy social schedule. And she wants to become a gymnast or an influencer when she's older. So my question to you is, which person or which child do you think has a longer and more successful sporting career? Now, ultimately, we can't pick one and we never know. There's been many childhood prodigies like Tiger Woods, Lionel Messi, the Williams sisters, who've gone on to emulate their childhood success. But despite that, we would suggest that adopting a multitude of sports and playing many different sports is typically the optimum way to try and develop a broad range of skills and capacities that can then lead into your final sport or your sport at the end of your career or as you age. Okay. Other benefits of multiple sports are that children are going to learn multiple different skills. It's going to help prevent burnout and increase participation for longer, and reduce the risk of injury, improve cognitive skills and decision making, typically more enjoyable as it offers some breaks in between different sports. And also we know that early sport diversification is linked to a longer sporting career, as we already mentioned. Okay. Forgetting about sport for a minute, we know that children nowadays are typically slower when compared to children 30 years ago. They are weaker when compared. They are less physically literate and less physically active. Okay, so introducing children who may not be playing sport to physical activities like our strength and conditioning is going to be really important. We also know that less than 5 hours a week of physical activity can increase the risk of injury. Obviously, there's a bell-shaped curve here that we know if we do too much training, that can also be a risk factor. But I think this became quite evident off the back of COVID, where we saw an extended period of not training, followed by a spike or an increase then in our training load. And this is something that we've associated with an increased risk of injury. Okay. We spoke about strength and conditioning. So what is strength and conditioning? The bottom left here, we have an example of what it doesn't look like. So obviously too heavy, too young, a bit of tongue-in-cheek photo there. And moving on though, we have examples of multiple different movements: crawling, jumping, landing, running, moving, lifting, squatting, and in an environment that is safe, fun, cohesive, but also challenging. So we have conditions here that make the exercise task a little bit more challenging, or the constraints a little bit more challenging. And as they progress and get older, then we move up to maybe loading those exercises or those patterns to still continue to increase the challenge or difficulty. Obviously, there are certain concerns and or misconceptions around strength and conditioning. It's important to note that strength and conditioning isn't just gym-based and strength-based. Speed and agility and muscular endurance can be enhanced by this, although we won't talk too much about these particular components today. And we already mentioned that the improvements it can have in our physical literacy, our skills, balance, and flexibility. As mentioned, one of the concerns typically is around it being dangerous, but it's important to note that sport in general is equally, if not more, dangerous. Okay, this is an example of such. So we know that sport in itself is inherently dangerous. So the better we can condition and prepare our young athletes for this, the safer they may be when they do take the field. Okay, some other common misconceptions are around stunting growth. This stems from anecdotal data that elite weightlifters are small and stocky, therefore weightlifting must stunt their growth. This is akin to saying playing basketball will make me taller because all elite basketballers are tall, therefore playing basketball will help increase my height, which obviously isn't the case. We spoke about the dangers. Other misconceptions can be that it will make you slower, done properly. Proper strength and conditioning should help increase speed rather than slow us down. Building big muscles, again, this is highly unlikely in youth athletes, as we don't have the hormonal profile that's going to allow for this, and typically takes years of training to do so. And growth plate injuries. Your epiphyseal growth plate injuries that were once of concern has largely been disproven and is more likely to occur in jumping and landing and our field sports as opposed to our gym-based sports. Okay? There's been a host of research to back this up and evidence to back this up, that weight training in youth is safe, that long-term responses to it are positive, and then position statements from the UK and US Strength and Conditioning Association from some of the lead authors in this area, in particular Rodri Lloyd, Dr. Avery Feigenbaum, John Oliver, to name but a few. Okay, so this table here shows the incidence of injury in some youth sports. Okay, so looking at some popular field sports like rugby league, soccer, and GAA, and looking at the incidence of injury over 100 hours of match play. What we can see here is that the incidence of injury in these field sports is considerably greater than our weightlifting activity. By weightlifting, we're referring to the sport of Olympic weightlifting. You'll see two studies here in particular. Boys and girls as young as 7 had a 0 incidence of injury over 1 and 2 years. And this study here, where there was 1 injury, happened with a weight plate falling on the foot. So not even the sport itself, but rather from maybe not paying attention during the down period within the activity. Okay, again, emphasizing the safety of these when done properly. Okay. The injuries in these activities are typically as a result of poor technique, excessive loading, as we've shown in that picture earlier, training while fatigued, perhaps maybe not paying attention then, and a lack of qualified supervision. This is an important point to note, that we need to make sure that the people who are supervising and running these sessions are qualified. I'm sure there's a host of coaches and parents on the call here who work with these young age grades and know how difficult it can be to keep them engaged and supervised. And so I have a lot of respect for anyone working with these young athletes and young groups, but it is important that whoever is leading these strength and conditioning sessions is appropriately qualified. Okay. The benefits then of strength and conditioning can help increase our strength and power, bone strength and density, balance and coordination, speed and agility, reduce injury risk, enhance our sports performance, and our outlook on physical activity. This is particularly important maybe for people who don't play sport, and offers another avenue for exercise to encourage and engage with exercise and physical activity without necessarily partaking in a main sport. Okay, this again is another example of the time-lapse injuries in an elite soccer academy. This is Arsenal. Prior to 2013 and Des Ryan and his team taking over, they had quite a high incidence of injuries. After 2013, when they implemented a world-class strength and conditioning program, they significantly reduced the number of injuries over the next couple of seasons. Okay, obviously we can't completely eradicate injuries, as we already mentioned. Sport in itself is injurious and particularly risky, but we can do with good strength and conditioning, we can decrease those numbers. They actually published a paper on this for anyone that is interested, showing their pathway, working with functional competency first and progressing up through different phases, some key considerations throughout developing a soccer academy S&C program. Okay. When can we start? How young is too young? This study by Rodri Lloyd and Fagenbaum, who we mentioned earlier, showcased that those who started during pre-adolescence achieved a greater level of motor capacity in adulthood relative to those who started during adolescence, relative to those who only practiced sport, and relative to those who did no sport or conditioning. So again, showcasing the earlier we start, the higher the ceiling we can achieve. Okay. Again, this is a youth physical development model from Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver, again, showcasing the subtle differences between male and female, but also emphasizing some key areas. So anything in bold is something that should or could be emphasized during that age grade. So initially we're thinking functional movement or basic functional movement. As we progress on and get older, we're thinking more sport specific skills. Training initially will start with very low or unstructured means fun, progressing into more structure and more high-end control instruction. Okay, and it's worth noting that there are some subtle differences here. We know that females mature earlier than boys, although some boys may not fully mature ever. If anyone is looking to read into this a little bit more, there's an excellent book by the two authors, and then the paper here around that is shown here. This is an example of a long-term athletic development model specifically for weightlifting. Okay, so what we see here again, it's quite low structure to start. These are some suggested ages here. They're not necessarily prescriptive. Obviously, anyone who does start, irrespective of what age they start, is going to start in stage 1 and gradually build up. A 12-year-old, though, may progress a little bit quicker than a 6-year-old, for example. Stage 1 encompasses fundamental moving or weightlifting skills with a focus on physical literacy. As we progress here, again, still staying quite low structured, quite fun, quite engaging, with still a competent or focus on technical competencies. And as we progress on, then after a number of years of training, we can still focus on our technical reinforcement whilst adding a little bit more load or more performance-based outcomes, and then finally progressing into performance or elite level, whereby we're focusing now more on performance and load. Okay. Again, just to go through these stages in a little bit more detail, stages 1 and 2 are going to be largely based around body weight training and mastering the basic exercises and movement patterns, progressing into maybe some soft resistance, things like med balls, sandbags, and then finally progressing into your barbell training. This is similar for our power progressions. Important to note that strength underpins power, although both are important. Utilizing some power exercises can help ensure that we get the maximal transfer across from our strength training. Okay, again, similarly here, we're interested in jumps, hops, throws, and gradually introducing maybe some light resistances before we consider moving on to more weighted or loaded progression. Okay, so when do we progress from body weight to barbell training? When we have good control over our own body and limbs, good positions and patterns in the 6 major movements. Okay, so for example, 6 of those movements might look like this. So this is an example from a youth scoring table. So when you can achieve 18 points in each of the exercise categories, that's a sign that you've mastered or you're competent with your own body weight and are ready to progress on to loaded variation. Okay, so for example, here we get points relative to the number of repetitions we do. Points add up over the different tests, and that allows us to achieve our 18 points plus. Again, those scores may be a little bit different for our male youth athletes. Okay, if we wanted to then put that together in more of a template for programming, again, in our beginner or young phases, we're starting with fundamental movement. We're starting with body weight, so less intensity and less frequency, maybe 1 to 2 sessions a week. As we progress, we might increase the amount of sessions or increase the intensity, whilst reducing the volume. Okay, and that continues to progress on as we get older and more competent. Speeds increase, intensities increase, number of sessions may increase, and the rest time will then also have to increase to accommodate that. Okay, so advice in summary for our parents, I would encourage everyone to try and get their children to engage in PE. That way they're going to see a multitude of different sports and skills, to get out and play with their friends as best or as much as possible, to incorporate at least one rest day a week where we're completely away from structured sport, to try and play different sports in the off season, and particularly when the down season is there, that gives us an ideal opportunity to sample other sports, and communicate across sports. So if we are playing a multitude of sports, to make sure that you as the parent are communicating that across the coaches. Obviously, our soccer coach won't necessarily know what we did with our GA team, so it is important that someone acts as a go-between to liaise across the different sports and coaches. Try and reduce training load during growth spurts. We know if there is a heightened or a rapid spike in growth, that can act as a predictor for injury. So it is important during those periods that we reduce the training load, particularly the on-field training load, and that might be an opportunity where we can focus more on the strength and conditioning elements that we spoke about. Trying to introduce resistance training or strength and conditioning under qualified supervision, and to make sure that we have fun. Again, the more engaging and enjoyable we can make this, the longer we'll participate and the more benefits we'll see long term. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to reach out via social media or have any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Thank you.